When author Joe Bandel outlines Anchor 6, the Whirling Fields, within his philosophical framework known as the Oak Matrix, he makes a startling claim. The reciprocal motion of north and south magnetic fields is not just a mechanism of physics, but the literal primal vortex that births all matter from a loving embrace. We are looking at a modern metaphysical text, specifically Bandel's concept that these whirling fields power planetary rotation, attraction, and repulsion, and what he calls the perpetual tank current. It is a bold fusion of electromagnetism and spiritual generation, positing that an expansive outward surge of light meets an inward containing flow of electricity to generate all form without conflict.
It is a highly ambitious synthesis. To understand Anchor 6, we have to look at the broader context of Joe Bandel's work. Bandel, who's based in Minnesota, has a long background translating obscure early 20th century German fantasy and occult literature. Authors like Hans-Heinz Evers and Karl-Heinz Strobel. In his 2025 book, The Oak Matrix, Dance of Opposites, and its 2026 follow-up, The Oak Matrix Unleashed, he attempts to stitch together a general unified field theory of his own. He's not presenting a peer-reviewed physics paper. Instead, he's offering a system of personal empowerment that uses the language of hard science, chaos theory, and objectivism to explain human psychology and spiritual growth. The core of Anchor 6 is the rejection of duality as a war or conflict, redefining it as a cooperative, generative engine.
The phrasing in Anchor 6 is incredibly specific. He writes about the expansive outward surge, which he labels as light or source, meeting the inward containing flow, which he describes as electricity or womb. This maps traditional gendered archetypes onto electromagnetic phenomena. But physics strictly defines a magnetic field as a vector field that describes the magnetic influence on moving electric charges, electric currents, and magnetic materials. When Bandel says these fields power planetary rotation, is he speaking metaphorically about the human psyche, or does his framework actually assert a new physical reality?
Bandel deliberately blurs that line. In the tradition of esotericism and what some critics call quantum mysticism, the macrocosm and the microcosm are treated as identical. When he talks about planetary rotation and magnetic attraction, he is drawing on the very real physical properties of the Earth's dynamo, the churning liquid metal in the outer core that generates our magnetosphere. But in the Oak Matrix, this physical reality is elevated to a spiritual principle. He uses the literal mechanics of the universe as a metaphor for internal human energetics. The North and South are polarities. In human terms, they represent the masculine and the feminine, the conscious and the unconscious, the expansive will and the receptive container. His argument is that just as the Earth requires both poles to maintain its protective shield and balance, human beings require the integration of these opposing psychological forces to manifest their desires in space and time.
That brings up the concept he refers to as the perpetual tank current. In electronics, a tank circuit, an LC circuit containing an inductor and a capacitor, stores electrical energy oscillating at its resonant frequency. It is a self-maintaining cycle of energy exchange, at least until resistance dissipates it. Bandel claims this current is self-maintaining when balanced, actively impelling manifestation in space-time when aligned. It sounds like he is taking a fundamental principle of radio technology and applying it to consciousness.
He is doing exactly that. The tank circuit is an elegant analogy for emotional and spiritual energy conservation. In radio electronics, the capacitor stores energy in an electric field, and the inductor stores it in a magnetic field. The energy sloshes back and forth between the two. Bandel adopts this to describe how a person's vital energy operates. In his 2026 writings on directing focus for abundant vitality, he emphasizes that where attention goes, energy flows. He argues that most people drain their energy through scattered attention and external manipulation, like commercial advertising or toxic social dynamics. The perpetual tank current in the Oak Matrix represents a closed, balanced internal system. When your expansive outward desires and your inward receptive emotional state are in harmony, your energy does not leak. It oscillates perfectly within you, self-maintaining. Once you align that internal resonance with a specific goal, it actively pushes that goal into manifestation.
I can see the psychological utility in that metaphor. We often talk about feeling drained or uncentered, and visualizing an internal circuit that conserves energy could be a useful cognitive behavioral tool. However, the risk in this kind of literature, the blending of hard terminology like magnetic fields and tank currents with metaphysical concepts like the primal vortex, is that it can easily be misconstrued as empirical science. A physicist would point out that magnetic fields do not possess a loving embrace. They simply follow Maxwell's equations. Does Bandel acknowledge the metaphorical nature of his framework, or does he insist it is literal science?
Bandel positions his work as a Frankenstein's patchwork, in his own words. He describes the oak matrix not as a set of cold equations, but as warm, breathing truths. He readily admits that the matrix is a highly distilled philosophy intended to act as an antidote to societal conditioning. He explicitly calls it a framework upon which a person can build their own paradigm or belief system, comparing it to a software upgrade for the modern mind. So while he uses the terminology of physics, his intended application is deeply psychological and spiritual. He's writing in a lineage of thinkers who believe that the language of myth and religion is no longer sufficient for the modern intellect, so they borrow the language of physics to describe the ineffable.
That lineage is quite long. We can look back to the late 19th century, around the time the authors Bandel translates were active. You had figures like Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophists, who incorporated the latest discoveries in electromagnetism and invisible rays into their spiritual texts. The discovery of X-rays and radio waves created a cultural moment where the unseen physical world seemed magical. It makes sense that someone immersed in that era of German literature would adopt a similar stylistic approach today, using chaos theory and quantum mechanics as the new frontier of mysticism.
The historical connection is vital here. Bandel translates authors from the early 1900s, like Hans-Heinz Ewers, whose work often dealt with the grotesque, the psychological, and the breakdown of rational reality. In the post-industrial, pre-World War I era, there was an intense cultural anxiety about modernization tearing the human soul apart. Duality was seen as a source of conflict. Bandel is taking that historical anxiety and offering a cure. Anchor 6 states that the generation of all form happens without conflict. This is a direct refutation of the Darwinian view of nature as a war of all against all, or the Freudian view of the psyche as a battleground between the id and the superego. Bandel is proposing a universe fundamentally driven by cooperation, a loving embrace between opposites.
The phrase generating all form without conflict is deeply provocative. If we apply that to the physical world, it ignores the sheer violence of cosmic evolution. Stars exploding in supernovas to forge heavy elements, tectonic plates grinding together to form mountains, predators and prey driving biological adaptation. Conflict, tension, and destruction seem to be the primary engines of creation in the material universe. To claim that form generates without conflict feels like a romantic sanitization of reality.
That is the primary critique of the oak matrix from a strictly materialist or scientific perspective. The physical universe is inherently violent. However, Bandel's defense would likely rest on his definition of the word conflict. In a mechanical engine, pistons fire and gears grind. To an outside observer, that might look like violent conflict. But the engine itself is a closed system of cooperative forces designed to produce forward motion. The explosion in the combustion chamber is not fighting the engine. It is the expansive outward surge being met by the inward containing flow of the cylinder wall. They are working in a reciprocal motion. Bandel is asking the reader to shift their perspective. What we perceive as destruction or war in nature is actually the primal vortex functioning exactly as it should. The loving embrace is not a sentimental human emotion. It is the perfect, frictionless fitting together of necessary opposites.
So the loving embrace is structural rather than emotional. It is the concept of a lock and a key. A lock and a key do not feel affection for one another, but they are reciprocally designed. The tension between them unlocks the mechanism. If we take Anchor 6 as a psychological model, This suggests that our internal contradictions, our anger and our compassion, our ambition and our laziness, are not supposed to be conquered or suppressed. They are supposed to be put into reciprocal motion.
Precisely. The Oak Matrix, especially in the secondary text, The Oak Matrix Unleashed, emphasizes integrating the ego with the shadow or instinctual self. Rather than going to war with your own dark impulses, you provide a containing flow for them. You balance the expansive, sometimes destructive surge of raw vital energy with a conscious womb-like containment. This creates the perpetual tank current. The energy is captured and cycled, rather than being vented out in a destructive outburst or repressed until it causes psychological illness. Bandel asserts that this internal integration is the prerequisite for becoming an architect of your own reality.
Let us examine the specific wording again. Expansive outward surge, light, source, meeting inward containing flow, electricity, womb. In standard physics, light, or electromagnetic radiation, is an outward propagation of energy. But classifying electricity strictly as an inward containing flow is unconventional. Electricity is the movement of electrons, which can certainly surge outward. It seems he is mapping the concept of gravity or magnetic attraction onto electricity to force it to fit the archetype of the womb or the feminine container.
The mapping is imperfect from a hard science standpoint, and you are right to flag it. In esoteric anatomy and hermetic philosophy, which Bandel is clearly influenced by, electric energy is often categorized as masculine, projective, and fiery, while magnetic energy is categorized as feminine, receptive, and watery. Bandel flips or modifies these traditional esoteric definitions to suit his matrix. By labeling electricity as the inward containing flow, he might be referencing the way an electric field in a capacitor contains and stores the charge, holding potential energy in a static, womb-like state until it is discharged. He is creating his own lexicon. To engage with the Oak Matrix, the reader has to accept Bandel's specific definitions of these terms, treating them as specialized symbols rather than standard scientific vocabulary.
Which places his work squarely in the realm of modern myth-making. He is crafting a new mythology for an era defined by technology and physics, rather than agriculture and seasons. The Oak Matrix demands that the reader conceptualize themselves as a bioelectrical engine. I find the phrase actively impelling manifestation in space-time when aligned particularly telling. It echoes the core tenets of the New Thought movement and modern manifestation culture. The idea that adjusting your internal energetic frequency alters the external material world. Is Bandel offering anything structurally different from the law of attraction?
The difference lies in the mechanics he proposes. The mainstream law of attraction often promotes a simplistic, think positive thoughts to get positive results model. It ignores the shadow self and avoids negative emotion. Bandel's Anchor 6 requires the incorporation of both poles. You cannot just have the expansive outward surge of light, you must have the inward containing flow. If you only focus on outward expansion, constant positive thinking, constant action, you burn out. The system breaks. The Oak Matrix argues that manifestation requires the friction of opposites. It demands a highly disciplined conservation of energy, identifying what drains you and sealing those leaks to build up the perpetual tank current. It is much more demanding than passive manifestation. It requires radical self-awareness and the integration of your darkest, most chaotic elements.
It is a framework that asks the individual to take total responsibility for their internal ecosystem. If the primal vortex that births matter from a loving embrace exists within us, then our failures to manifest our desires are failures of alignment. The reciprocal motion has become unbalanced. While the physics terminology may not pass peer review at a university, the psychological imperative is clear. Stop fighting yourself. Recognize that the opposing forces in your life and in your mind are not enemies, but components of a living engine. If you can balance the outward surge with the inward containment, you might just find the power to generate form without conflict.
And that is the ultimate promise of Anchor 6.
It re-enchants the modern worldview, taking the cold, indifferent forces of electromagnetism and infusing them with profound purpose and intimacy.
Whether viewed as a profound psychological tool or a fascinating piece of modern esoterica, Joe Bandel's Whirling Fields challenge us to rethink the mechanics of our own internal energy. If this breakdown of the oak matrix shifted your perspective on how opposing forces work in your own life, pass the episode along to a friend who might appreciate the deep dive.